team. So I'd love you to take a few minutes to talk about your background and what brings you to this work.
Okay. So my background has nothing to do with anti-violence or violence interruption or like you, sociology or criminology. I was trained as a lawyer and I practiced law for 25 plus years. And I was a very special kind of lawyer. I was specifically a China focused business lawyer. So I did, big cross-border M&A deals and other kinds of complex transactions. And I lived in China for many years. And it's actually the coming back to live in the United States after living abroad for many years that sort of made me realize that something had shifted while I was gone. And that indirectly led me into this work.
I didn't know that about you. I didn't know that's where you did your work. I mean, I knew you were obviously knew you were a lawyer, but I bet there's some good
Yeah,
stories there.
I started studying Chinese in the early 80s and in my undergraduate degree focused on Chinese studies and in the context of
Can you
international
talk
studies.
a little bit more about what that piece of it, about what attracted you particularly to be doing this work now? What the connection was between
Well,
life and this one?
yeah. So when I left to go live overseas, it was around the time the United States entered um, into the Iraq War. And so I had been going to China for many years and at various times had been agitating that we move there and live there. But we had this great life in the Pacific Northwest. And my husband was always like, why would we go live in China? And I finally persuaded him to go with me on one of my business trips at the best time of the year in the autumn when the weather was really good and we had this great time. And so he became more open to the idea and we ended up moving there. And so when we left, the Iraq War had started and it was a very contentious time in America, as those of us who were there then remember. But when I came back in 2015 to live, I mean, I would come back on little visits or on business trips in between, but I never lived in the United States then from the time we moved to China until 2015. I was stunned by how polarized and separate people had become, that everything had it felt like people had sort of hunkered down in their holes and there wasn't a lot of common ground there anymore. It was just like this pockmarked landscape. And I was pretty stunned. I mean, I was from the Pacific Northwest. I lived here up until then, other than when I was studying Chinese at various times. And so I felt like I knew the landscape, but then when I came back, something had really shifted. And I became increasingly worried about the way rhetoric and narratives were being used to dehumanize us, really, and delegitimate our system of government and our connections to one another, and things just felt like they had become very black and white, and that if you didn't use the exact perfect words to talk about a sensitive topic, you were ascribed all this bad will and bad intention, and um, it was really a stunning change. And maybe if you've been living in the United States the entire time, that would have come up more gradually and you would have adapted to it. But it was striking to me how different things were. And that indirectly ended up kind of heading me in this direction. I was working in this, I retired from the practice of law in 2016 and was doing writing projects and kind of volunteer work of various kinds and some consulting projects. And I became so worried about the escalating political rhetoric and the way it seemed to me, especially the spring of 2020, to be used to legitimate violence against Chinese people. You'll recall that that was when people were talking about the Wuhan flu or the China virus. And I had been actually to Taiwan in March, and there they were actually calling the COVID vaccine the Wuhan flu. But they weren't doing it with an intent to necessarily demonize a whole people. And I saw what was happening and thought, this is really going to result in people getting hurt. And sure enough, that is unfortunately what happened. The incidence of hate crimes against Asian Pacific Islanders in the last 3 years has just gone through the roof. Anyway, I was talking to a psychiatrist who was very familiar. A lot of her research work had focused on violence in community settings. And she told me about this epidemiologist who had done all this work about how violence is contagious. And she mentioned that he too was very concerned about what he was seeing. And she introduced me to him, and his name was Gary Slutkin, who was the founder of Cure Violence Global. And so we ended up collaborating in the summer of 2020 on some projects. And up until then, Cure Violence Global had really worked on violence in community settings, or what we think of as gang violence, but hadn't really focused on political violence. But Gary felt strongly that the same dynamics were in play, and that was why he was so concerned. And they were working at that time with the Carter Center, and as you know, after the election, Cure Violence Global started working on this project in 2021, looking at the Pacific Northwest as a specific node of where extremist violence was taking hold across the political spectrum. And so then they asked me to work with them on this project, which is how I got to know you.